Well, welcome back, everyone, to I guess this is our third kind of season of Bible study stuff. And this time, instead of Genesis, we are going to briefly turn our attention to the Psalms. And so for the next 4 weeks, we're going to look at the Psalms. One, tonight, we're going to do an overview of the Psalms, give you a couple of bits of background information about how the Psalms are engaged kind of from an academic level, give you some terms and some ways of pulling them apart a little bit. And we might look at a Psalm or two as we have time. But the main thing we're trying to do in this 4-week period is we've got a special guest in the next 3 weeks. He will not be joining us tonight, but our special guest is Rabbi Dr. Daniel Rosenberg. I've mentioned this several times if you've been in church or on the Facebook page, but he is a great storyteller. He has a depth of knowledge of scriptures of the Hebrew Bible, but also of the New Testament that you don't find often. He also knows the rabbinic commentaries really, really well. And so we're really happy to have him join us and engage with us in the Psalms. And he is going to be bringing 3 specific Psalms to us. And I believe it's 82 and, oh, I should have had this up in front of me. I know which 3 it is, but I didn't write it down to put it in front of me. I'll have it. There'll be a break at some point tonight. I'll find it and I'll tell you what those are. But in any case, we're going to look at 3 specific Psalms in the following 3 weeks. And that will be our very short 3rd season of this Bible study. And that will then lead us into the Lenten season. So I hope that this offers a opportunity for us to dig a little bit into it. And maybe we can find a way to return to the Psalms at a future time if this is something that everyone enjoys. But as I said, welcome back. I'm so glad we get to do this again. I did mean Advent and not Lent. That would be a much longer series if this was leading into the Lenten season. Thank you. It's good to have people who are looking after me on this. All right. So I just want to open up to get us all talking a little bit. If you want, take yourself off mute for a moment and share a little bit about your either knowledge of, engagement, favorite Psalm, anything that is kind of, well, let me give you a specific question. When you engage the Psalms, is this something that is enjoyable for you, annoying, you wonder why you do it, and follow that up with some sort of specific, some specifics about why you feel that way when you engage the Psalms.
I have sorry, I'm in the dark. We're just unloading Costco order, but I love the Psalms. I think because I grew up in the music world, I've always found them really poetic, and I like the poetry and the imagery that they kind of draw out and the storytelling. And I don't know, I like that it's not super literal, and I know that drives a lot of people crazy, but I really like that.
Do you have a favorite Psalm?
Not that I can just pull out of my hat. I'm sure I do somewhere.
Okay. Fair enough. Cool. Would anybody else like to share?
Similar to Taylor, I adore the Psalms because I think most modern Christian music, like, at least has some, you could trace it back to some Psalm. When I was in kindergarten, I memorized Psalm 23, and I probably have said that Psalm to myself, I don't know, hundreds of, nope, thank you. Sorry, my kid's running around in her underpants. Go away. Forgot we were recording. Oh, well. But I've probably said that Psalm to myself, thousands of times. And I think for a long time, it was my, like when I was scared as a kid, I would say that to myself. There you are. But but yeah, I adore the Psalms. I think they're kind of like hymns. They're like, they have a lot of like theological, really cool things in them, and genuinely are very poetic and beautiful and like music.
I lost teeth.
And the Psalms are very real, and children jumping onto Zoom is also very real. So, I mean, it's just on brand. So wonderful. Would anyone else like to share?
Hi, bye.
Right. Like I said, on brand.
So being married to a therapist, we in our household, like feeling all the feels is allowed and encouraged. And I think I really like the Psalms because you see a picture of that, right? Like you see a picture of like every emotion under the sun, like we're representing, there's songs of sadness and songs of rage. And I think it is this like beautiful picture of like humanity and all the feels that we have. I mean, that's totally not the theological answer, but like in terms of like very realness, and I appreciate that of the Psalms.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah, I think there are some reasons for that impression that we're going to engage tonight, and this idea that there is theology in there, and then there's also a lot of feeling in the Psalms. This is one of those interesting places in the Bible where you kind of get a really nice balance of both. And so that is one of the reasons why I think people are attracted to the Psalms. Would anyone else like to jump on?
I like Psalms 139.
Psalms 139. All right. Do you have a particular reason for that, or is it just?
It just touches me, and search me, oh God.
Okay. Very good. Thank you. Anyone else? I'll say, for me, I did not like the Psalms growing up. I didn't hate them or anything, but I just didn't find a lot of value in them. I didn't understand them, and I felt like they weren't direct enough for me, right? Because there was probably a lot of feeling in there, as opposed to like in the New Testament, you get a lot of exposition or argumentation. That's direct. You get in other places in the Hebrew Bible, you get a lot of story. That was direct. But the Psalms were a lot less, much less direct and tangible for me. And so it took me a long time to start wrapping my mind around the Psalms. And I honestly feel like it's only been in the last 2 to 3 years where I've really started to grow in an appreciation of the Psalms. And so I find that I'm exploring them rather freshly myself. And so that's one of the reasons why doing this is exciting to me. So, well, let's talk about the Psalms kind of. I'm going to give you, tonight is a lot about background and a little bit of some maybe academic hooks that we can put our understanding upon. So if you know any of this stuff, go with me. If you don't know it, I hope you enjoy learning about this. But let's just start with this. Maybe this first thing is obvious, but the Psalms is a very different kind of book in that it wasn't written like one to chapter whatever all by itself. It is an anthology.
I need the email. I need the Zoom link. You didn't send it to me. Hi, everybody.
I will do that right now.
Thanks. Or Megan, if you want to send it to me, I just texted you, but so you can keep going. I just didn't know if Megan was seeing my message.
I'll get it. Christian would turn off my phone to clean it, so I'll send it to you on the line or on web.
Thank you.
Cool. All right. Well, and with that break, I'm going to quickly tell you which Psalms Rabbi Dan is going to cover with us. because I found it. Psalm 82, Psalm 19, and then he gave me an or, Psalm 145 or 148. So we'll see which one he decides to go with. But those are the three that we're going to be engaging in the next few weeks. All right, back to our regularly scheduled program. So the Psalms is much more of an anthology than it is a kind of a work that was composed with an overarching, plan or a narrative or something like this. So what it is a lot of different songs that were gathered together. It is quite clearly not by one person, but rather by a lot of people, and it is a collection. Okay, so anthology, yes, collection. There are lots of types of psalms, and this is one of the things that is really interesting to me. Again, this book kind of defies a simple categorization, other than the fact that they are psalms, poetry that have been collected together, but they are all different types. And the three most common types are hymns, lament, and thanksgiving. Those are the three most common types. Now, there are two other common types, a little less common, known as wisdom psalms and royal psalms. So those are the five most common, but the first three are much more prevalent than the second set that I gave you. There are a couple of kind of smaller categories as well that you should know about. Some are known as enthronement psalms. The idea about talking about Israel's God, Yahweh, being enthroned and what that means. There are individual and communal Thanksgiving songs. And then here's one of what I find to be most interesting. There are individual and communal complaint psalms. And those complaints, in many ways, are the most common types of psalms that there are. Now, they come in several different varieties, which is why they're not like some of them are hymns, or some of them are found within lament or something else. But the idea that the theme is complaint is the most prevalent type of psalm we have in the book of Psalms. So I ask one question of you, which you may or may not want to answer right now, but at least think about it as we go through, is what does it say about this book as a whole that the most common type of psalm is complaint? And that the community decided that this was an important thing to keep as part of their communal and cultural heritage. I see Leisha wrote, it's human. Yes, I completely agree. But it didn't have to be complaint. It could have been something else.
But I mean, I think that given their the exile, all that, they had some good reasons to complain.
Sure. Yeah, no, absolutely. But let me ask this though, right? I think on this side of the Bible being canonized and something that we've had for 2,000 plus years, it's easy to say that they had reason to complain, yes, but why? What is it that they felt that this was an okay thing to keep and maintain as part of their cultural and literary history? I think that's a slightly different thing, because I completely agree. It's human, and it is, they had a lot of reason to do it. But the idea that they said, this is something that we value enough about our religious life that we should hold on to it. That's not something you find in a lot of religious traditions. You
I have
following
a
me?
thought. I have a thought.
Yeah, go ahead.
The the thing that always made Yahweh, the God of the Bible, different was that the people were in relationship with him and he cared for them and he loved them. So to me, whenever you would hear about the other gods of the time, I wonder if that's why they kept it, because it was like he cared for them and let them complain, whereas the other gods were more, I don't know, like spiteful or whatever. So I wonder if that has something to do with it.
Maybe. And I'm not trying to suggest that I have a definitive answer here, but it is something worth noting, I think, that somehow this community decided that this was worth retaining, or they were enabled to keep it. Whether that was the specificity of the relationship that Israel had with her God or something else. I don't think it was an obvious answer to them back in the ancient world. I think part of what I'm kind of thinking about this on the fly. I kind of feel like it's, what am I trying to say? The idea is that they may not have known like that what they were doing was different and unique, and they just felt like, hey, somehow, because it's not like they compared themselves or their God to other gods in all the facets that we might do, given the ability to look back on history. They would just know, like, we have our God, you have your God. And so they wouldn't have said, we get to do this because your God is less accepting than ours is. They would have just kind of went, I guess our God finds this acceptable. Right. So that, I don't know, it's kind of something I'm just thinking about out loud as we got into this. All right, we don't have to linger. Let's just keep going. So I mentioned that the Book of Psalms is an anthology, and there are 150 of them. And it appears that the book was collected in 4 phases. There are 4 stages to the collection of this Book of Psalms. And the first stage was that every individual psalm was at some point written down. Or, well, yeah, it was probably composed and then it was written down or something like this. But at some point it was written down. Whether it existed in just a purely oral form or not before it was written down, that's kind of a different element to this than I'm talking about. But what I'm talking about is each one was somehow composed individually. Stage 1. Stage 2 is that several psalms would then be linked together with other psalms to form a small collection. And by small, I mean often something around 5 to 15 psalms. Okay. The third stage then was that several of those small collections were gathered together into larger collections. So they would grab the small collection, maybe 2 small collections, maybe 2 small collections and a couple of individual psalms, and then throw them into a larger collection. That's stage 3. And stage 4 was kind of taking those bigger collections and smushing them together in one large book of approximately 150 psalms. Okay, so how do we know this, or why do we think this? Well, there are a couple of things. One, the titles of the psalms. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the titles later, but the titles tell us something about understanding the collection of the psalms. So there are lots of psalms that explain where they came from, or how they were collected, or who they're for. And so we'll unpack that shortly. But the titles give us a clue about this stage of the 4 stages of development. Let me give you one example. Psalm 72, verse 20, should probably be understood as the concluding portion of an earlier collection of Davidic psalms. So let me say that again. Psalm 72, 20 is probably the ending of a small collection of Davidic psalms. Why do we know this? Because it ends with this phrase, David ben Jesse, right? Ben meaning son. So David, the son of Jesse, his prayers are ended. So that suggests that there was a small collection that ended with that verse. Davidic meaning by David, exactly. Right. So it's kind of weird for it to say his Psalms are ended in the middle of the book of Psalms. So that suggests it's part of a different collection or a different stage of the collection. That's one reason. Another reason that is really interesting is that there are some duplicate Psalms. In fact, identical Psalms that occur multiple times, like 2 times. For example, Psalm 14 is virtually identical to Psalm 53. Psalm 40, verses 13 through 17, is the same as Psalm 70. And then another one is Psalm 108 is the same as 2 different songs put together, which is Psalm 57 verses 7 through 11 and Psalm 60 verses 5 through 12. That only happens if there is a different stage of the process of collecting Psalms, right? And it appears that, like, to make this simple, 14 and 53 are virtually identical. 14 was collected into one set and 53 was collected into another set. And then when those sets were put into larger sets, that's how they are identical Psalms in a larger set. Does that make sense? Okay, so what are some of these early collections? So there is a collection of Davidic Psalms, quite well known as Psalms 3 through 41, but not 33. Okay, so 3 through 41, but not 3. It's also, some other Davidic songs are 51 through 70, but also maybe not 66 and 67. And then Psalms 138 through 145. So those are the Davidic Psalms. There are others that may have circulated independently or split off from those collections, but like those chunks, it seems pretty clear were gathered together because of the common ascription to them as being Davidic. We'll unpack what Davidic means in a few minutes. Another collection, there are the Psalms of Asaph. So that's Psalms 73 through 83, and maybe also Psalm 50. Okay, there's the Psalms of the sons of Korah, and that's 42 through 49, but not 43, and 84 through 88, but not 86. Wouldn't this be a lot easier if they just like grouped them and without the exceptions? Yeah, okay, but that's not the way it happened. There's a collection of Psalms that is not based on a person or a group, but on a common type. And these are known as the Psalms of Ascents, that is, of going up, right? And those are Psalms 120 through 134. And so those Psalms are all about going up to Jerusalem. It's funny. I went to Jerusalem when I was in grad school, and it talks about how lofty are the mountains of Jerusalem. And I got to Jerusalem and I thought, like, these mountains are not lofty. Like, these people never saw the Rocky Mountains. They had no idea. But then you realize it's not literal, it's metaphorical, right? They are spiritually lofty, not literally high elevations. So, all right, there's one more group I want to tell you about, and those are known as the Egyptian Halal or Praise Collection, and that's Psalm 113 through 118 and 146 through 150. So those are some of the early collections that we feel pretty confident were gathered together in that small group. those 5 to 15 usually size group, stage 2. So then we got stage 3. And those are it's a larger collection. This is kind of a speculative stage, according to Psalm scholars, but they really categorize this as like 3 different groups. The first group is 1 through 41, and that is a group of Psalms that is grouped together because they use the name Yahweh as the divine name a lot. That's the primary thing that unifies them beyond some Davidic ascriptions. The second group is Psalms 42 through 83. And this group uses the divine name Elohim much more frequently. So this is sometimes called the Elohistic Psalter. Let me type that. So Elohim, Elohistic Psalter, right? In some cases, it appears that they even took Psalms that might have been Yahwistic and changed the name of Yahweh to Elohim. So we go back to Psalm 14 and 53. They are identical except for their second verse. So let me show you this. I'm going to share my screen. And here we go. Oops. Right? Psalm 14. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt. They have committed abominable deeds. There is no one who does good. Verse 2, right here. The Lord has looked down from heaven upon the sons of men, etc., etc., etc. And you can see, as I'm highlighting it in the English, Lord, over here in the Hebrew, you might see some Hebrew letters. Let me make it bigger. I'll make the English bigger too. Lord. And those 4 letters are Yud, He, Vav, He. That's known as the name of God, Yahweh. All right. So there we go. Let's now look at Psalm 53. For the choir director, according to the Mahalath, the Maskil of David, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt and have committed abominable injustice. There is no one who does good. God has looked down from the heaven upon the sons of men. Okay, same thing, but you can see in the Hebrew, as it's highlighted, that's not Yud, He, Vav, He. That's something else. That's the word Elohim. And so this psalm is effectively identical, except for the fact that they have taken out the name Yahweh and put in the name Elohim. All right. Does that make sense? Cool. All right. So that's the second group. Elohim means God or gods, depending on the context. And it's almost a name by the way it's utilized for Israel's God. And Yahweh is just the divine name, and there's a lot of debate about what the name means. When Moses meets God in the wilderness, he says, who shall I say sent me? And he's like, basically, I am, or I will be who I will be, something like that. And so a lot of people think that that's kind of what is meant by Yahweh is he will be, or he continually is, or something like that. Yeah. All right, so that was the third stage of gathering into these 3 big groups. Lastly, that fourth stage of gathering all the big groups into one book called Psalms, what we did was, somebody did, gathered the big collections. Now, potentially, Psalm 1 and 2 may not have already been a part of that group, so they may have been added at this time, either Psalm 1 and 2 or just Psalm 1, and they were added at the very beginning of this book in order to be an introduction to the entire group of Psalms. So a lot of people see at the very least Psalm 1, if not both Psalm 1 and Psalm 2, as an introduction to the book. And also, after they gathered them all together, they added Psalm 150 as a suitable conclusion to the book of Psalms. And as we look at those at some point here, we can read them with looking to figuring out if they feel like suitable intros and conclusions, right? But then the last thing they did was they kind of broke it up into groups that were different than all the groups that have preceded us in our conversation so far, into 5 books. And you will often see in your English Bibles, it might say Psalms book 1. And book 1 is Psalms 1 through 41. And if you look right before Psalm 42, it may say book 2. So does anyone have a Bible, and do you see that?
My Holy New King James Version has book 2.
It has book 2? Yeah. Yeah, I've got a book 2 here in my New American Standard Bible. Okay. Book 2 is Psalms 42 through 72. Book 3 is the short one. It's Psalm 73 through 89. Book 4 is Psalms 90 through 106. And book 5 is 107 to 150. So it was yet a new and exciting way to divide up the Psalms into smaller chunks. We might call them chapters or something like this, but they call them books. But there we go. So that's an overview of kind of a high level view of what the Psalms are as a book and kind of how we got from individual Psalms to how they were collected together and eventually into this one group of 150 Psalms. So does anyone have any questions so far? Comments, snide remarks?
Yeah, I was late, so just that, but all over again. Thanks.
Okay, starting again. The Psalms are a collection. Oh, no, I'm kidding. We are recording, so there will be a link that you can watch this
I
at a
will
later
definitely
time.
watch. Thank you.
You bet. Any other questions that we, to make sure we're still on the same page? Cool.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Corey. I'm sorry, kind of processing. Can you repeat what you said about the books being compiled and how there's 2 separate same Psalms in different areas and why that is?
Oh, yeah. Okay. So probably in that second stage of development where they took individual Psalms and gathered them into small collections, like I mentioned, usually about 5 to 15 Psalms in a collection. It might have happened, and it seems to have happened specifically with Psalm 14 and 53, that one collection gathered 5 songs that included that Psalm in like, let's just call it Psalm A because they wouldn't have had numbers at that point. So brought it in as Psalm A in collection A. And another collection gathered a bunch of other ones, but also grabbed that Psalm A into this collection B. And so that's how an identical Psalm kind of could end up in 2 different groups. And then as they get these small groups get gathered into larger groups, all of a sudden it's like you've got 2 identical Psalms within the group. Does that make sense?
So what you're saying is it'd be like if I had a playlist and he made a playlist and we happen to have the same song in our playlist.
Yeah. Yeah. That's good. That's a good analogy. One of the reasons it might have been kept when they gathered it into a larger group is because of the very small differences. I mean, here's the thing. Ancient Israelites, especially those who are dealing with texts, were very close readers of the text. It's not like they didn't know that they had two versions of it. They knew. So their choice to keep it said something. Yeah. It wasn't an accident. Now, we may not exactly know why they chose to keep it, but I am fully convinced that they were 100% aware of that. So, all right. Any other questions? All right. Well, let's go on to talking about Psalms at a closer level. We started at like a 50,000 foot view. Let's look at it from a 5,000 foot view, 10,000, whatever. So Psalms, each one has a title, or not all of them, but 116 of the Psalms have a title. And what does that mean? Well, again, if you look in your English Bibles, like so, again, I'm pulling out an English Bible here. And if you have one like me, just opening into a random one, I'm looking at Psalm 40. Under the bold that says Psalm 40, it's got two lines that are in a smaller font, and they don't have a verse number on them. So that is what English Bibles tend to do, is they take a title and they put it in a small font under the Psalm number. Now, in Hebrew, that is typically verse 1. And so verse 1 in English then becomes verse 2 in Hebrew. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. So the thing is, most of the Hebrew Bible versus English are identical 98-99% of the time, except in the Psalms. The Psalms are quite frequently one verse off all the time. And the Hebrew will have a higher number because the title is verse 1 and then verse 2 through whatever. Whereas in English, verse 1 just becomes this little superscription underneath the Psalm number. And what's verse 2 in Hebrew is verse 1 in English. Okay. Not a big. Go ahead.
Are there any English translations that mirror the Hebrew and do the numbering scheme the same?
Yes. The Jewish Publication Society does an English version.
Okay.
And so, you know, they're inclined to keep it exactly the same.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. So one of the things that may happen is if you ever look in a commentary or you look online or you see somebody referencing a psalm, sometimes the reference might be one verse off from what you expect. So you always have to check that when somebody's saying, oh, it's Psalm whatever, Psalm this, verse that, figure out which one they're talking about. Because if it's somebody who's highly academic, or especially like an Old Testament scholar, they may be referring to the Hebrew numbering system and not the English numbering system. And you're wondering why they're saying something about, you know, the text, and you're like, this doesn't seem to say that at all. I don't understand. It might just be that it's one verse off. Okay. And I say that in one sense as a protection for me, right? Because I always look at the Hebrew numbering system. I sometimes forget to check whether the English is the same. So there you go. All right. A lot of these titles may not have been original to the psalm. So that's kind of interesting. They may have been attached as people were gathering into collections. And unfortunately, it is then hard to date these Psalms with precision. And a lot of the titles of these Psalms may in fact be post-exilic, meaning after the exile of Israel and Judah into Babylon. Well, Israel's not a thing to go into Babylon, but whatever. As they go into exile in Babylon, right? So titles tend to have 5 things. So the first thing they tend to have is they might identify a psalm with a person or a group. So a couple of examples: Psalm 3, Psalm 72, Psalm 90. So you can check those out really quickly if you want to look at those. So a lot of Psalms are Davidic, right? They're from David, or we'll get to that in a moment. Some are Solomon, like Psalm 72 or 127. Moses is Psalm 90. Asaph has 12 of them. Haman the Ezrahite, Psalm 88. Ethan the Ezrahite, Psalm 89. The sons of Korah have about 11 of them. And the musical director has about 50 psalms associated with him or her, probably him. So those are a lot of people that are affiliated with Psalms. Now, let's talk about what it means for a person to be affiliated with a Psalm. Let me look again at, I'm going to share the screen again. Okay. So Psalm 3 says, a psalm of David when he fled from Absalom, his son. Okay, so here's the Hebrew. Mizmor, a psalm. La David. So you can hear David, David. But what I'm focused on right here is this la. This is in Hebrew what's known as a lamed. It's effectively the L sound from English. Now, you've seen what I need you to see, so I'll come back. The Hebrew lamed, when it's attached to a name, can mean a lot of things. It can mean for, it can mean to, it can mean by, it can mean concerning or about, or it can mean for the use of. And I'll let you cogitate on that while I let my dog out. Are you kidding me? Right. So how do we know which one? And that's a lot of options. The lamed in other contexts often means ownership, which is one of the reasons why people think that this means, David, quote, owned the psalm. Whatever that means. Does it mean he composed the psalm? Well, tradition has suggested that he composed a lot of these psalms, but it's not entirely clear that that's exactly what happened. Did he himself compose them? Was he a king and somebody composed them within his court and then he got credit for it because he was in charge of the kingdom? I mean, that's not an unreasonable suggestion because, for instance, when a president is the sitting president, if somebody in his administration passes a law, they get credit for it. So that's not crazy. But it could mean it was written for him or even to him or about him. So when they talk about the Davidic authorship of all these Psalms, I think we have to take it with a grain of salt. And it's a little hard to decide whether or not it really was by David per se. So any thoughts about that? Any questions or concerns?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Do we know because I know that in my head, David's a musician. Now, is he a musician in my head because he's credited with Psalms, or is it stated in like historical stuff that he's a musician?
It is stated in First Samuel that he's
Okay.
a musician. But it's a little strange there.
Okay. It's a
And
little
the reason I say that is because it kind of serves no purpose in the text. It's just kind of mentioned. He never acts like a musician except in that it places him in Saul's court. Right? He is known for being a charismatic military leader. And we see that throughout First and Second Samuel. And so he's known as this, warrior and leader. And then it feels like the musician part is tacked on. And so it's not clear whether that's tacked on because it's, well, you should know this about him too, or, well, we've got this tradition that he wrote all these Psalms. Maybe we backfill that into the story. Right? And I don't have a good answer for that.
Yeah, because in my head, it would make sense for David to have written them because in my head, David's a musician. So it'd be like, well, of course he wrote them. Like he was a musician and he's credited as having written them. So who else would have wrote them? Like, why would we doubt that? But if it's like they did it to kind of, yeah, anyway.
Yeah, well, here's the other thing, right? Somebody famous like David is going to get credit for things he may or may not have done. Does that make sense?
Wes says he likes to play secret chords.
That's true. That's pretty funny. The other thing is, he may have composed these Psalms, but he was a shepherd boy. I'm not saying no. What I'm saying is it's interesting that this kind of humble shepherd boy might have known sophisticated Hebrew poetry or been able to compose sophisticated Hebrew poetry. Right? It seems more logical to me that somebody else wrote it about him and then he gets credited for it than it is that he was both a wonderful leader, military, political, and also happened to be brilliant at poetry. People who succeed in life often get credited for more than they are capable of. Everyone wants to know what, Jeff Bezos thinks about something or other, and like, who cares? He's good at business,
Or
he not to say
he might have just gotten beat with the talent stick,
I mean, exactly. This is not to say he didn't. This is just to say, like, we shouldn't just have a default supposition because the tradition says it. Because the Hebrew does not make it clear that he wrote it. That's all. So what I'm trying to do is separate out the biblical text from the traditions about the biblical text. And so we take the traditions and we engage them as far as they're helpful, and then we try not to make that shape our understanding of Scripture. So that's the idea. That's the reason I linger on this point. Okay. All right. So I mentioned that there are 5 types of information that are in titles. The first is an identification with a person or a group. The second is purported historical information. We see this in Psalm 18 or 34, or as we saw in Psalm 3, when David, fled from Absalom, right? Again, we got to take those with a grain of salt because we don't know how close to the writing of the psalm this was, whether that was the intended result or not. The third thing is musical information, which is found in Psalms 4 and 5, for instance. Sometimes it says, sing this to the song of blah, 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 blah. Like, I think one of them is like the tune Lilies, right? The fourth thing is like liturgical information, like Psalm 38 or 100. Let me see if I can tell you what that meant. For instance, Psalm 38 says, a Psalm of David for a memorial. So what kind of liturgical setting are we doing this in? A memorial. And then the fifth is the type of song. So Psalm 32 or 120 or 145. So those are 5 types of information you may find in a title. And there are, as far as I know, there are none that have all 5 types of information. Usually they have 1 or 2. Sometimes there might be one with 3, I don't know. But usually you get 1 or 2 things in there. Okay, so that's about the titles themselves. Then let's talk a little bit about Hebrew poetry. So Hebrew poetry works, as you might imagine, differently than English poetry or any other poetry of any other language. Poetry tends to be very language specific, or at least language family specific. And so the reminder is that this was probably originally meant to be sung, and it is definitely poetic, again, not necessarily like our poetry looks. So it seems pretty clear that some of these psalms were composed orally and perhaps even spontaneously, whereas others seem to have been composed more formally, like, you know, sitting down and figuring out how the psalm should go. I'm going to pause one last time. All right. So how does Hebrew poetry work? Well, one, it's not based on rhyme. So a lot of English poetry is based on rhyme. And this makes sense because English has like a lot of ways to form words. And so words end in dozens of ways. And so finding rhymes that are also meaningful semantically is an interesting challenge for English writers, composers of poetry. Hebrew, like a lot of Semitic languages, like a lot of languages that have verb forms that changed based on their tense or their gender and number, a lot of words end in exactly the same way. So rhymes are not as challenging. They're certainly not as challenging as they are in English. So it's kind of easy to find rhymes in Semitic languages. And so that wasn't a valued principle of poetry, right? So what did they look for in their poetry? Well, the first thing they looked for was something called parallelism. Easy for me to say. So parallelism came in 2 varieties. The first is synonymous. So this is the idea that you would offer the repetition of a thought on one, like a thought on one line, and then repeat that thought on the next line using different words. Does that make sense? Yeah, good. I'm seeing some positives. Cool. Excellent. So the idea is simply that you say it one way, you say it the next way, a different way, but it means the same thing. So I didn't write down an example for this particular one. We can come up with them and it won't be too hard. The other idea is something called antithetical parallelism, which is the opposite of synonymous. That is, you write something on one line expressing an idea, and the next line expresses the opposite idea, but again, using different words. So this parallels ideas, not rhyming schemes. We good so far? Another idea that was used in Hebrew poetry is the idea of rhythm or meter. So this is really debated within the Psalm scholarly community about how exactly this works. But certainly the idea that you would have maybe 7 beats to a line, and then the next line would have, 5 beats or something like that. That was a way of structuring poetry that was more common in the Semitic languages, and Hebrew in particular, kind of like a haiku, where you get that idea of 5 syllables, 7 syllables, 5. So Hebrew would have some of those poems, rhythms and meters, right? Sometimes this is known as a strophe. You might see this word. I'll type that word because you might see it, right? It's the idea that it is a rhythmic system composed of 2 or more lines repeated as a unit. And it's a structural division of a poem containing stanzas of varying length. So you might, like I said, get a strophe that is, 7/5. So you get that over and over again, or maybe spread out sporadically as a refrain that would carry through the psalm, that kind of thing. Other things that were important in Hebrew poetry were simile and metaphor. And then one I think we talked about in the Genesis study was chiasmus or chiasm. So that's the idea that you kind of say A, then B, and then B, then A, The idea is that just that you're using mental like ideas, that you put idea 1, idea 2, and then you give a slight variation on idea 2 and a slight variation on idea 1. So we've talked about that. Last thing I want to cover for tonight on the kind of me spewing things at you side is just the idea of the theology that exists in the Psalms. And that, according to one scholar of the Psalms, John J. Collins, he lists a couple of things that are important to note. One is the theology of the human situation. And it often refers to specific or particular experiences of adversity or deliverance from adversity. So that's one major theme. A second one is Sheol, or the pit, or the inevitability of death. Happy. A third major theme is the kingship of God. This is a metaphor that runs throughout the Hebrew scriptures, that God is king, and Israel is subject to God as he is the sovereign. They're his vassals, so to speak. That's very specific language that gets utilized in the Hebrew Bible. And sometimes we see that kingship of God theology echoed throughout the Psalms. A fourth major emphasis in theology in the Psalms is the theology of human kingship. The idea that they celebrate the human king who may in some way be the earthly counterpart to the heavenly king. And so there are some Psalms that have some really interesting ideas that we can explore at some point in our study here. And lastly, the fifth thing that I want to bring up regarding theology is the idea of the character of God. So God is expected to answer prayers. God is expected to be present. And typically, those offering psalms to God are expecting deliverance and not vengeance. So like, I would like you to deliver me rather than take vengeance upon my enemies, although that exists too. Or please don't take vengeance upon me if I've done wrong and deserve this, right? So in general, it's easy to think of, may God bash my enemies' heads. Those kinds of things stick out in our mind because they're so graphic. But in general, the requests in the Psalms are more about deliverance than they are about vengeance. So those are some of the themes. And so let me come back to something we started with, which is kind of why. Why are these the types of theological notes that get hit? Why do we have both theology and the feels in the Psalms? And this is a reminder, I think, that the Psalms are unlike most of the rest of Scripture in that most of the rest of Scripture is God talking to us or us relating stories about how God engaged us or directed us or something like that. Psalms is one of the few places where, in general, we or the psalmist is talking directly to God, or at least as a collection, right? Of course, this exists in other places, but there's no place where you have such a concentrated chunk of material that is about we, God's people, speaking to God. And that offers a unique insight into what it means to be a community of people who hold faith in a particular deity and find value in the whole range of things that we can and do say to God. So, any thoughts before we maybe look at a particular psalm or something like that? Questions, comments?
I have a question. It's not
Yeah.
necessarily super on topic, but you frequently will say like Psalm scholars or Genesis scholars when you're talking about, people you pull from or whatever. When you went to school, did you specialize in like a book like that?
Some schools will, it's not necessarily that a school does it, but that an individual will go to a school and then they say, this is where I'm focusing.
Was yours Amos? Is that?
No, not quite. I focused, what I tended to focus on was early Israelite religion.
Right.
And therefore that had implications for particular books as opposed to other books.
Interesting.
Okay, so some people will be like, I do poetry, and then that would lead them to Psalms or something like that.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense.
And so it's kind of like a Venn diagram, for instance. So somebody might be interested in, early Israelite stuff like me, and that's why I like Judges, and I talk about Judges. And if I wrote a commentary, I would write about Judges. But somebody else might be coming at it from a completely different angle, like political leadership and how that manifested in ancient societies. Oh, and they also want to look at Judges. And so we just come at it from different places, but we overlap in Judges, something like that. Yeah. There are definitely people who all they do is study one small section of the Hebrew Bible or New Testament as well, right? Depending on what they do. Yeah. That was, by the way, the reason I ended up going to NYU in the first place was because there was a guy there named Mark Smith at the time who focused on two things that were really fascinating to me. One was ancient Israelite religion, which I ended up doing a lot of. And the other is he did a lot of stuff on Ugaritic. And that made a lot of sense because, long story short, Ugaritic is another language. There's a corpus of texts, a lot of which is insightful about religion in the area in that time. And so it provides a nice counterpoint to understanding Israelite religion.
So that's like where you learned about the the side by sides you showed us, like within Genesis and like the Babylonian whatever it was.
Yeah, so all the Babylonian stuff is yet another corpus of material, and that was one of the other people I studied with, Dan Fleming. So, but again, that's why I chose to go to that school, or why I chose to apply to that school, because of what they were covering specifically. If I wanted to do Psalms, I would have looked at different schools, for instance. Yeah. Any other thoughts or questions? Well then, let's go ahead and take a few minutes before we finish this evening up. And I'll show you, let's see. Let me check two things real quick. I'm going to show you one of my favorite Psalms, which is Psalm 13. Can you see that okay? Is it big enough? So I'm going to move the Hebrew over a little bit. You don't need quite so much. Okay. So this says, this is a computer program, so it doesn't quite know how to write the little superscription of the title. So it says Psalm 13 verse 0. That's kind of interesting. And it says, for the choir director, a Psalm of David. So you all, now being sophisticated readers of Psalms, know what that is, right? It's telling us like who it's for and who it's purported to be by, right? So that's kind of interesting. That also suggests that if it's for the choir director, it's for some sort of liturgical setting. That is, they use this potentially in a communal worship kind of setting. So this is not just a one-off, nor is it inherently individualistic, except that it's for the individual perhaps to say, I, like all these other people around me, have experienced this. So that's kind of interesting. So what's going on here? This kind of feels like a lament, or maybe I shouldn't have said that. Maybe you should have told me what you think it feels like. How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long shall I take counsel in my soul, having sorrow in my heart all the day? How long will my enemy be exalted over me? Consider and answer me, O Lord my God. Enlighten my eyes, or I will sleep the sleep of death. And my enemies will say, I have overcome him, and my adversaries will rejoice when I am shaken. But I have trusted in your loving kindness. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me. So, do you notice any themes in that resonate with what we've talked about tonight?
Super cheerful.
It is super cheerful. So
I always love, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I always love how Psalms is just like, woe is me, everything is terrible and the world is coming to an end, but you're God, so I'm gonna trust you and we'll keep going. Like, it's so real. Like, I think I've said that exact, like in modern day language, but I've said this exact thing, like, oh, okay, everything sucks and I'm dying, but
yeah,
it's just so funny.
Well,
I love that even like the old school humans were still like, they were like us.
Yeah, highly relatable, right? I think the two things that I'm enjoying about this are, one, this idea that it's for the choir director, therefore it's liturgical, therefore it's communal. And all the words are, how long shall I? It's still I within the context of everybody around me saying exactly the same thing. Therefore, it's not just about me. It's about everybody. And that's actually an insight I hadn't even thought about until literally tonight. That's one. The second one that I really liked was this idea of the expectation that God is listening, right? Consider and answer me, O Lord my God. Like, not, geez, I guess you won't. Like, I'm just yelling into an empty void. Rather, it's like, I'm complaining because I trust you enough to complain to you. Yeah. So I don't know if anyone has heard me talk about Psalm 13 before. Psalm 13 might be one of my favorite Psalms overall. And one of the reasons is this. In verse 5 in the English, it says, "But I have trusted in your loving kindness." And that word "but" is a problem for me. So "but" is used in semantic ways to say X, but Y. And what that means is when I say Y, because I've said "but," I'm contradicting X and I'm asking you to dismiss it from your mind. Okay. They use this in advertising all the time. So for instance, I think it was L'Oreal, the makeup company, used to say, "We're expensive, but you're worth it." Right? The idea is we're going to acknowledge that we're expensive, but come on, you're totally worth spending all this money. Like, dismiss that as an irrelevant point. You're worth this. And what's doing the heavy lifting there is this word "but." Okay. Volkswagen in the 60s actually said, "We may look funny, but you'll enjoy the savings on gas." Right? So this has been a technique that has been utilized by advertising companies, quite literally. So for me, the idea that it says, "Oh my gosh, oh my gosh, oh my gosh, oh my gosh, but I've trusted you," I think is a mistranslation. This word in Hebrew is the word "the." That's it, "the." And it typically can be translated as "and" or "but." It can be both. There are a couple of other options as well, but those are the main two ones. So I don't think like English translations are being irresponsible to call it "but," because they're trying to contrast what comes before verse 5 and what comes after it. But my problem is that semantic notion that it's all this bad stuff, dismiss it, it doesn't matter, I will trust. Rather, I like the idea that it is and it's important semantically for me to say that, right? The idea is all this bad stuff and not dismissing it, and I trust in your loving kindness. This is not I have to set aside the reality of my world in order to trust God. This is in the midst of all the hard things, I trust God. This is, I am not screaming into the void. I have an expectation that you're there. And so I trust you to say these things to you. And for me, that one, it's quite literally one letter in Hebrew, I think makes all the difference in how you understand this psalm. And so I always insist that this is not "but I have trusted," but "and I have trusted in your loving kindness," et cetera, ad nauseum. So there we go. That's my take on Psalm 13. Any further questions, comments? All right, well, next week we're going to have Rabbi Dan with us, and he's going to unpack, I believe Psalm 82 is the first one he's going to do. And I hope you will show up ready to listen, ready to have some good questions, as you always do. And I look forward to seeing you all next week. Good night.